A pack of bears circles a lost scientist. When he realizes why, his heart is filled with hope. Dr. Adrian Cole stood at the edge of the Bitterroot National Forest, the vast expanse of snow-dusted pines stretching out before him like a frozen sea. The winter winds of Montana cut through his thick jacket, biting into his skin as if nature itself was testing his resolve. Yet, despite the bitter cold and the isolation, the snow-covered landscape held a strange kind of peace. It was a peace Adrian had sought for months, ever since the sudden death of his wife, Carolyn. He had traded the sterile walls of his lab, the unrelenting demands of academic life, and the weight of his once prominent career for the quiet, unforgiving wilderness of the Northern Rockies. The retreat wasn't an escape for Adrian. It was an attempt at something deeper, something more elusive, healing. As a renowned neuroscientist, Adrian had spent his life unraveling the complexities of the human brain, chasing answers to questions that seemed to grow only more complex with each discovery. But the knowledge he had so ardently pursued had never prepared him for the deep, gnawing ache of loss. Carolyn's sudden death, the result of an unexpected and aggressive illness, left him shattered. The house they had once shared felt like a tomb, every room echoing with her absence. The vibrant colors she had brought into his life faded, leaving only the stark whites and grays of a world that no longer made sense. She had been his partner in every way, the one who had kept him grounded, the one who had understood the sacrifices of his work, and the one who had given him a sense of purpose beyond the lab. But now, alone in their empty home, Adrian could only stare at the photographs of their life together and wonder how he had gotten so lost in his pursuit of science that he had failed to see the fragility of their time together. It was in the midst of this despair that Adrian decided to leave behind the life he had built, to retreat to a remote ecological center nestled on the edge of the Bitterroot. The center, run by a small group of environmental researchers and conservationists, promised nothing more than silence and solitude. No lectures, no research papers, no publications to obsess over. Just time to breathe, to think, and perhaps to start the long process of healing. The center's director, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Richards, had welcomed Adrian with open arms, understanding the space he needed. "Sometimes the answers we seek aren't in data and experiments," she had said with a knowing smile. "Sometimes they come in moments of stillness, in the quiet of nature." For the first few days, Adrian had done little more than walk the forest trails, taking long, solitary hikes through the snow-covered pines, letting the sharp air clear his head. His mind, once consumed with the complexities of the human brain, now seemed to wander aimlessly, unable to grasp the elusive sense of peace he had hoped for. He was still haunted by the image of Caroline's face, her laughter, the way she had always known when to ask him to take a break from his work. His mind refused to let go of the past, clinging to every memory like a lifeline. It was on the third day of his stay that Adrian decided to venture deeper into the forest. He had learned that the area around the center was a sanctuary for wildlife, a protected zone where endangered species could thrive away from human interference. He had seen the wildlife from afar, deer grazing near the outskirts of the forest, the occasional wolf pack moving silently through the trees. But today, Adrian felt the need to push farther, to test his limits and perhaps unknowingly his own survival instincts. The path was difficult to navigate, with thick layers of snow covering the trail. The air was thin, and each breath burned in his lungs as he trudged forward, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. The further he went, the more the forest seemed to close in around him, as if it were silently watching, waiting. He couldn't help but notice the way the trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow, bending slightly under the weight. The forest felt alive, but not in the way he had expected. It was a living, breathing entity, as old as time itself, and it made him feel small, insignificant. It wasn't until he reached a clearing that he saw it. There, in the center of the snow-laden expanse, was a grizzly bear, trapped in an illegal steel jaw trap. The massive creature lay on its side, its chest rising and falling with labored breaths, the trap clamped tightly around its leg. Adrian's heart skipped a beat. Grizzly bears were common in these parts, but the sight of one in pain, trapped in such a barbaric device, was something he had not anticipated. The bear's fur was matted with snow, its eyes wild with fear and pain as it struggled against the trap. Nearby, two other adult bears stood still, watching. They did not flee, nor did they attack. They simply stood as silent guardians, observing the scene before them. Adrian's first instinct was to turn and run, to escape the danger that was so clearly present. But as he watched the trapped bear's desperate movements, something inside him shifted. The scientist in him, the one who had spent years studying the mechanics of the brain, instinctively sought to understand. The empath in him, however, felt a deep, primal need to help. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, the air growing still and heavy as Adrian weighed his options. The bears, despite their imposing presence, showed no signs of aggression. They were merely waiting, watching, as if allowing him the choice to act. His breath visible in the cold air, Adrian approached the injured grizzly with caution, each step measured as he slowly made his way toward the bear. The two adult bears watched him closely, their eyes following every movement, but neither made a move to stop him. Adrian crouched beside the trapped bear, his hands shaking as he reached out to release the trap. He had no experience with animal care, let alone the tools to deal with such a situation, but he did what he could, gently prying open the steel jaws and pulling the bear's leg free. The bear growled low in its throat, but it did not strike. Instead, it remained still, seemingly accepting his presence, its wild eyes fixed on him. Adrian checked the leg, noting the deep wound that had been caused by the trap. He carefully bandaged the injury with what little he had on him, his heart racing as he worked. When he finally stood up and took a step back, the bear remained where it was, watching him with an intensity that was almost human. The two other bears, still standing at a distance, did not approach, but neither did they leave. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken communication, and for a moment, Adrian felt as if he were no longer just a man in the woods. He was a part of something larger, something ancient and far more significant than any academic discovery he had ever made. The connection between them, between man and beast, was palpable, and Adrian felt it in his bones. The moment stretched on before Adrian slowly turned and began to walk away. The bears did not follow, but neither did they retreat into the depths of the forest. They simply watched, their dark eyes following his every movement, as if marking his departure. Adrian's mind was in turmoil. He had expected a reaction from the bears, perhaps an attack or a flight. But instead, there was only silence. It was a silence that spoke volumes, one that lingered long after he had left the clearing and returned to the safety of the center. That night, as Adrian sat in front of the fire, his mind raced. He couldn't shake the image of the bears, especially the way they had watched him, almost as if they understood something he didn't. The forest, it seemed, was watching him too. As he lay in his bed, the wind howling outside, Adrian knew something had shifted. His time in the wilderness had already begun to reveal answers, but not the ones he had expected. This was not about science, about data or knowledge. It was about something far deeper, something that transcended the boundaries of human understanding. The bears and the forest itself had something to teach him, and whether he was ready or not, Adrian had been chosen to listen. Adrian woke early the next morning, the pale light of dawn seeping through the thin curtains of his cabin. The wind had died down, leaving the forest outside still and serene, the snow-covered ground gleaming like a blanket of diamonds under the weak sunlight. It was a far cry from the violent storm that had raged the night before, and the quiet seemed almost too perfect, too still. Adrian stood by the window for a long moment, staring out at the snow-laden trees, his breath fogging up the glass. His mind kept replaying the events of the previous day, particularly the encounter with the grizzly and the two other bears that had watched him in such silence. There was something profound about that moment, something that defied the logic and reason he had spent his life relying on. He had expected fear, or at the very least, aggression, but instead, there had been nothing but stillness. The bears had observed, yes, but they hadn't reacted. And then there was the way they seemed to wait for him to leave, as if giving him the space to make his choice, to leave without interference. It was as though they had understood that he was a part of something much larger, something far beyond the boundaries of human knowledge. For the first time in a long time, Adrian felt like a speck in the vastness of the world, a world that seemed to be telling him something he didn't yet understand. The strange encounter lingered in his mind, gnawing at him, and despite the peace that the wilderness had offered him thus far, Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a prelude to something far more significant. He dressed quickly, pulling on his warmest layers, and headed out into the cold morning. He knew he needed to return to the clearing to see if the grizzly bear had moved on, and to understand if his act of compassion had truly made a difference. But as he made his way through the snow-covered woods, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the forest pressing in on him, as though the trees themselves were watching his every move. He had walked these trails for days now, but something had changed since yesterday. Something that made the forest feel less like a sanctuary and more like an entity with its own intentions. Adrian had always been a man of logic, a scientist who believed in facts, in hard evidence. He had never been one to entertain ideas of fate or destiny, but the events of the past 24 hours were making him question everything he thought he knew. He had always prided himself on his ability to separate emotion from science, to look at the world with a detached curiosity. But now, standing in the heart of the forest, he was beginning to feel a deep sense of connection to the wilderness, as though it were calling to him in ways he couldn't explain. As he walked deeper into the forest, Adrian's thoughts drifted to Mia Thompson, the indigenous ecologist who had offered to help him with his research. Mia had grown up in these very mountains, a member of the Salish tribe, and had spent her life studying the natural world, not just through the lens of science, but through the stories and traditions of her people. She had told him about the legends of the bears, the old stories passed down through generations of Salish people. The Guardian Circle, she had called it. According to the legend, there was a rare bloodline of bears that carried the memory of the earth itself, a bloodline that had been passed down for centuries. These bears, Mia had explained, were not just animals. They were protectors of the natural balance, guardians of the land. And sometimes these bears chose a human to walk beside them, a human who had lost their way but could be trusted to help guide others back onto the path. Adrian had thought it was nothing more than myth, a poetic tale meant to explain the deep connection between humans and the natural world. But now, after his encounter with the bears, the stories Mia had shared felt like they held a deeper truth. Could it be possible that the bears had chosen him? That he, a man driven by the need for knowledge and understanding, had been brought to the forest for a reason? The thought was absurd, of course, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something had changed in him since the previous day, something that went beyond his grief and his isolation. As he approached the clearing, Adrian was met with the same eerie stillness he had felt the day before. The snow was undisturbed, the ground blanketed in a layer of white, as though no animal had passed through. He scanned the area, his eyes searching for any sign of the grizzly bear, but there was nothing. The two other bears were gone as well, leaving only the silent trees and the crisp, frozen air. Adrian felt a pang of disappointment. He had hoped to see the bear again, to somehow connect with it, to understand why it had allowed him to help. But instead, there was only the emptiness of the forest. He turned to leave, but something caught his eye, a small, unusual shape near the edge of the clearing. He walked closer, his curiosity piqued. It was a rock, or so it seemed at first. But as he crouched down to examine it, Adrian realized it was more than that. The rock had been carefully arranged into a perfect radial pattern, the stones placed in a symmetrical shape, as though someone, or something, had deliberately positioned them in a specific way. It wasn't just a random pile of stones. This was intentional, deliberate. Adrian's heart raced as he examined the pattern, his mind racing with possibilities. Could this be some kind of marking? A message from the bears? It was impossible to say, but as he knelt there, studying the stones, a sense of awe washed over him. The forest was alive, not just with the usual sounds of animals and the rustling of trees, but with something deeper. There was intelligence here, a form of communication that went beyond words, and somehow he had become a part of it. He stood up, his thoughts swirling, and began walking back toward the center. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him, something fundamental. He was no longer just a scientist, detached and objective. He was a man who had been touched by something greater, something wild and ancient, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. That evening, as Adrian sat by the fire in his small cabin, he thought about the stone pattern, about the bears, about Mia's words. The forest was not just a place for observation, it was a place for connection. The animals, the trees, the very land, they were all intertwined in a delicate balance, a balance that had been maintained for centuries. And he had been brought here, to this very moment, to witness it. But why him? Why had the bears chosen him? The question gnawed at him, pulling at the edges of his mind. And then, as if answering his thoughts, he heard a sound outside, a low, distant rumble. It was the unmistakable sound of a bear's growl. Adrian's pulse quickened as he stood up, crossing the cabin in a few strides to the window. There, in the distance, he saw her, the large female with the white crescent marking on her chest. She stood at the edge of the clearing, watching him. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. She simply stopped in her eyes locked on his, as if waiting for him to make the next move. Adrian felt his breath catch in his throat. The connection was no longer just a feeling, it was real. The bears were watching him, guiding him, waiting for him to understand. The following days passed in a blur of uncertainty, each one blending into the next, as Adrian continued to search for answers. The presence of the bears lingered in the back of his mind, and every time he ventured into the woods, he could feel their watchful eyes on him, though he never saw them. The large female, with a distinctive white crescent on her chest, continued to appear at the edge of the clearing, always at a distance but never far enough to be out of sight. Adrian began to question if he was imagining things, if the weight of his grief and the isolation of the wilderness had finally pushed him over the edge. But deep down, he knew something real was happening. He felt it in the air, in the silence of the forest, in the way the trees seemed to bend inwards, as if the land itself was holding its breath. It was the kind of stillness that felt sacred, as though the forest was alive in ways he could never understand, and he was a small part of it, a visitor allowed to witness something extraordinary. His mind, usually consumed with the intricacies of neuroscience, struggled to process what he was experiencing. He had spent years studying the human brain, uncovering its hidden depths and mapping its complexities, but no amount of data could explain what was happening in the wilderness. The bears were more than just animals. They were a bridge to something far larger than he had ever considered. Adrian's thoughts turned to Mia. She had mentioned the guardian circle, the ancient legend that spoke of bears with ancestral memory, protectors of the natural world who sometimes chose a human to walk beside them. At first, he had dismissed it as nothing more than myth, a story to explain the unexplainable. But now, as he spent more time in the forest, as the bears continued to observe him, he wondered if there was more to the legend than he had originally believed. Mia had told him that the Salish tribe spoke of these guardian bears in reverence, that they were said to hold the wisdom of the earth itself. But it wasn't just their knowledge that made them extraordinary. It was their ability to trust, to choose a human who had lost their way, but could be trusted to protect the balance of the natural world. Adrian had never felt more lost than he did now. The grief of Caroline's death still clung to him like a second skin, and his career, once his driving force, seemed like a distant memory, something that belonged to someone else. He had retreated here to escape the noise of the world, but now the silence of the wilderness had become a mirror, reflecting back all his pain, all his doubts. He had come to the forest seeking peace, but instead he had found himself at the heart of something much greater, something that threatened to shatter everything he thought he knew. Adrian's mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts and emotions as he ventured deeper into the forest one cold morning, his boots crunching in the snow. The bears had become his obsession, their silent presence both haunting and comforting. Each time he saw them, he felt as though he was being drawn into something much larger than himself. But each time they disappeared, he was left with an overwhelming sense of longing. What did they want from him? What was he meant to understand? The wind howled through the trees and snowflakes swirled in the air as Adrian made his way to the clearing. As usual, there was no sign of the grizzly or the other bears, but Adrian felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the next move. He stood there for a long moment, looking out over the snow-covered expanse, his thoughts drifting back to the guardian circle, to the legend that Mia had shared with him. If the bears were indeed protectors, if they truly held the wisdom of the earth, then what was their purpose in choosing him? And why now? He couldn't help but wonder if there was something about his grief, his sense of loss, that had made him a suitable candidate. Maybe, just maybe, the bears had seen something in him that he hadn't seen in himself. Maybe they believed that he could heal, that he could find his way back to the world that he had left behind. Adrian had always believed in science, in the power of the human mind to conquer the mysteries of the world. But now, standing alone in the wilderness, he began to question whether science was enough. The world was not just a collection of data points and equations. It was a living, breathing entity, a web of interconnected forces that could not be understood with logic alone. He had spent his life trying to understand the brain, to map its intricate pathways. But perhaps the most important knowledge came not from the mind, but from the heart. He turned away from the clearing, his mind still swirling with questions, and began to make his way back to the center. But as he walked, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement at the edge of the trees. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat, and looked closer. There, standing just beyond the tree line, was a large female bear, her white crescent marking gleaming in the weak light. She didn't move. She simply stood there, watching him with those deep, intelligent eyes. Adrian's pulse quickened as he took a step toward her. His mind raced with the realization that this was no coincidence. She had appeared again, just as she had before. She was waiting for him. He took another step, then another, until he was standing only a few feet away from her. The bear didn't flinch, didn't show any signs of aggression. She simply stood there, as if inviting him to come closer. Adrian's breath came in shallow gasps as he reached out slowly, cautiously, his hand trembling as it extended toward her. He wasn't sure what he expected, whether she would allow him to touch her or retreat into the woods. But when his hand hovered just inches from her fur, she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Adrian froze, unsure of what to do. He had never been this close to a wild animal, let alone a grizzly bear, and the raw power that radiated from her was enough to make his heart race. But there was no fear in her eyes, no aggression, only something deeper, something that he couldn't quite grasp. The bear nudged him gently with her head, as if urging him to come closer. Adrian's breath caught in his throat, and without thinking, he reached out and placed his hand on her fur. The moment his skin made contact with her, something shifted inside him, as though the earth itself had opened up and he was being flooded with something ancient, something timeless. The sensation was overwhelming, like being connected to the pulse of the world, to the heartbeat of the land itself. The forest, the animals, the earth, all of it seemed to converge in that moment, and Adrian felt as though he had been given a glimpse into something far greater than himself. It was a moment of clarity, of understanding that he had never experienced before. The connection between them was not just physical, it was something spiritual, something that transcended words. Adrian's hand rested on the bear's side, and he felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The grief, the loss, the pain, it all seemed to fade away in that moment, replaced by a profound sense of belonging, of purpose. The bear stood still, allowing him to touch her, to connect with her in a way that words could never explain. Adrian didn't know how long they stood there, connected in silence. But eventually the bear stepped back, breaking the contact. She looked at him one last time, her eyes filled with something indescribable. Trust, understanding, maybe even gratitude. And then she turned and disappeared into the trees. Adrian stood there for a long time, his heart racing, his mind reeling. He had never felt so alive, so attuned to the world around him. He didn't understand what had just happened, but he knew one thing for certain. His life had changed forever. He wasn't just a scientist anymore. He wasn't just a man lost in grief. He was a part of something greater, something that connected him to the earth itself. And the bears, the protectors of the natural world, had chosen him. The days after Adrian's encounter with the bear felt surreal, as though the world around him had shifted ever so slightly, but profoundly. He continued to walk the trails of the Bitterroot National Forest, now keenly aware of the presence of the creatures that lived there. The bears had become more than just animals to him. They were guardians, sentinels of a world far older than human civilization, and their silence spoke volumes. Adrian had never imagined that the wilderness would hold such power, that it would call to him in the way it had. He had come to the forest searching for peace, But what he had found was a connection that went far beyond the tranquility he had sought. It was a connection that transcended logic, something deeply intuitive, something almost spiritual. Days passed, Adrian found himself drawn further into the mystery of the bears, into their unspoken language. They would appear on the periphery of his vision, always just far enough to remain elusive, but close enough to remind him that he was being watched. The large female bear with the white crescent marking on her chest continued to appear, always just out of reach, as though she were guiding him, leading him towards something unknown. It was during one of his walks that he finally understood what that something was. Adrian had been following the trail deeper into the forest than he had ever gone before. The snow had begun to melt in places, revealing patches of the earth beneath, and the forest was coming to life with the early stirrings of spring. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the sky was a pale blue, streaked with the faintest hints of pink from the setting sun. It was a peaceful evening, the kind that made Adrian forget the world he had left behind. But as he ventured further, a sense of urgency crept into his bones, as though the forest itself was urging him onward. The path narrowed as he moved deeper into the woods, the trees growing thicker and more ancient, their trunks gnarled and twisted like the hands of forgotten gods. It was then that he saw it, an ancient stone circle, nestled in a small clearing, its stones arranged in a perfect radial pattern. His breath caught in his throat as he approached, recognizing the pattern from the one he had seen in the clearing weeks earlier. This was no ordinary arrangement of stones. It was deliberate, it was ancient, and it was calling to him. As he stepped into the circle, the air around him seemed to change. The atmosphere grew heavier, as though the very ground beneath him was imbued with an energy that was older than time. The sense of stillness, the quiet that had always pervaded the forest, became even more pronounced. Adrian could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as he stood in the center of the circle, feeling an overwhelming sense of connection to everything around him. The earth beneath his feet, the trees that surrounded him, the animals that had watched him for so long. It was as if he had stepped into a different world, one where the barriers between the physical and spiritual had blurred. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and in that moment he understood. The bears, the guardian circle they belonged to, were not just protectors of the natural world. They were also protectors of a deeper truth, a truth that lay at the heart of the earth itself. It was a truth that humans had long forgotten, a truth that Adrian had been blind to in his pursuit of knowledge and power. The truth was simple, yet profound. The world was alive, interconnected, and fragile, and it was not for humans to conquer or control. It was for them to protect, to nurture, and to learn from. The realization struck Adrian with the force of a revelation, and tears welled up in his eyes as he stood in the circle, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had discovered. He had come to the forest seeking peace, but what he had found was a deeper understanding of his place in the world. He was no longer just a man consumed by grief and loss. He was a part of the earth, a part of the greater web of life that stretched across the land. He was not separate from it. He was connected to it. It was then that the bears arrived. One by one they emerged from the trees, their massive forms moving silently through the underbrush. The large female, with her white crescent marking, led the group, and behind her, Adrian could see the others, bears of all sizes and ages, their eyes fixed on him with the same quiet intelligence that had marked their previous encounters. They gathered around him, forming a circle of their own, their presence both awe-inspiring and humbling. Adrian stood still, his heart pounding in his chest as the bears watched him. He felt no fear. Instead, he felt a sense of reverence, as though he were standing in the presence of something sacred. The bears did not move toward him. They did not speak. They simply stood there, their gaze unwavering, as though they were waiting for him to understand. And then, and as if in response to his silent realization, the white crescent female stepped forward, her eyes locking onto his. She did not make a sound, but in that moment, Adrian knew. He knew that he had been chosen. Chosen not for his intellect, not for his achievements, but for his willingness to listen, to learn, to heal. The bears had watched him, had guided him, and now they had brought him to this moment, this revelation. He had been lost, but now standing in the midst of these ancient beings, he felt as though he had finally found his way. The connection he had experienced with the grizzly, the silent understanding that had passed between them, had been the first step on this journey. But now, standing in the stone circle, surrounded by the bears, he understood that this was not just a personal journey. It was a journey for all of humanity. The bears had not only saved him, they had shown him the way forward, the way to heal the world, the way to restore the balance that had been lost. The knowledge he had spent his life pursuing, the knowledge of the mind, was only a small part of the larger picture. True understanding came from the earth itself, from the creatures who had lived in harmony with it for millennia. It was a truth that transcended science, a truth that was both simple and profound. And it was a truth that Adrian had been entrusted with. The bears had chosen him not to be their leader, but to be their messenger, to carry their story to the world, to remind humanity of its place in the greater web of life. As the bears stood around him, their silent gaze never leaving him, Adrian made a promise. He promised that he would not let this truth fade into the background, that he would share it with the world, that he would do everything in his power to protect the natural world and its delicate balance. The forest had saved him, and now it was his turn to save it. In the days that followed, Adrian began to document everything he had witnessed. He recorded the behavior of the bears, the patterns he had observed, the subtle intelligence that guided their actions. But he also began to write down the deeper truths he had learned, the connection between the natural world and the human spirit. He was no longer just a scientist. He was a messenger, a bridge between two worlds. And though he knew the journey ahead would not be easy, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The bears had given him a second chance, not just to heal his own wounds, but to heal the world. As he prepared to leave the forest, he looked one last time at the stone circle, at the bears that had stood by him, and he knew that this was just the beginning. The world was changing, and he would be part of that change. The earth had spoken, and it was time for humanity to listen. A wild grizzly bear recognized the rangers after 2 years. What happened was incredible. The sky above Denali burned the color of rust and blood, the air dense with smoke and heat as flames devoured the forest with ravenous hunger. Trees snapped like bones in the distance, their brittle limbs surrendering to the inferno's march. Ash fell like snow, quiet and grim, dusting the charred earth with sorrow. Ranger Elias McKinley moved through the thick smoke, his fireproof jacket soaked with sweat, his breath shallow beneath the mask. The emergency beacon from a stranded hiker group had gone dark less than an hour ago. Time was measured now in heartbeats and decisions, every second a gamble. He moved quickly, ducking under fallen branches, his boots crunching on scorched moss. The forest, usually alive with the whispers of wind and birdsong, now groaned beneath the weight of fire and fear. Elias's thoughts were focused, purposeful, but even in his seasoned stride, something gnawed at his senses, an itch of unease like he was being watched. Then he heard it, not a branch snapping or the wind howling, but a cry high and keening, more a whimper than a roar. He froze, listened again. There it was, faint, trembling, a sound not meant for survival but for surrender. He changed course without thinking, the compass of instinct stronger than any logic. Over a ridge, through a clearing smothered in haze, he found the source. Beneath a blackened pine trunk lay a small form, caked in soot, trembling so violently it seemed to vibrate. A grizzly cub, alone, hurt. Elias's breath caught. The cub's paw was bloodied, swollen, pressed awkwardly beneath him. His fur, once thick and golden brown, was matted with ash and sap, a dull mask over what had once been wild innocence. Elias scanned the area for signs of the mother, for movement, a shape in the smoke, a grunt from the shadows. Nothing. No paw prints except the small ones leading to the collapsed pine. No sign of struggle. No blood trail. Just the cub, shivering in silence as the fire edged closer. Protocol was clear. Do not interfere. Do not bond. Wild stays wild. But protocol had never looked into eyes like these, wide, glistening with fear, and fixed on him with such complete and helpless trust that Elias forgot the rules, forgot the flames licking ever closer, forgot even the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. He dropped to his knees, slowly removing his jacket. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice hoarse with smoke and disbelief. "I got you." The cub didn't move, didn't growl or back away. Elias extended the jacket like a shield, and gently, so gently, he wrapped it around the little body, cradling it against his chest. The cub gave a weak huff, his head tucking into Elias's neck. For a moment, the fire receded from his thoughts, and the only thing Elias knew was the fragile rhythm of another heartbeat against his own. He carried him back through the smoke and fire, every step an act of defiance against nature and the bureaucracy that governed his world. At the rehab center, there were questions, raised brows, disapproval hidden behind clipped phrases and tight smiles. But Elias didn't care. The cub needed help. The vets worked fast. Stitches for the paw, salves for the burns, fluids to replace what fear and heat had stolen. They asked for a name. Elias offered Takakota, an old Athabascan word passed down by his grandmother, meaning friend to all. The name settled over the cub like a promise. In the weeks that followed, Elias visited daily. At first, he stayed outside the enclosure, sitting quietly, speaking in low tones. The cub would perk up at his voice, eyes following his movements, breath softening when Elias whistled. Over time, that whistle became a signal. One sharp note followed by two short ones. A call, a greeting, a memory. They taught the cub to fish in shallow streams, to forage in controlled areas, to climb and run and behave as wild things should. But something deeper formed too: trust, connection. When Takakota slept, it was curled at the edge of the enclosure closest to Elias. When frightened by thunder or the clang of metal, he would press his nose to the fence, searching for his human. It wasn't supposed to happen, that kind of bond, but it had, and it was real. The center director warned Elias of the consequences. "He must be wild," she said. "If he associates humans with safety, he won't survive." Elias nodded but said nothing. What could he say? That he understood? That he'd let go? He didn't believe it himself. But in the end, he knew Takakota deserved a chance. The release came on a gray September morning, the trees just beginning to burn gold with autumn. Elias stood beside the open transport cage, hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. The forest beyond was quiet, waiting. Takakota hesitated, sniffed the air. Then, without drama or pause, he walked out, his gait awkward from the still healing paw. At the edge of the tree line, he turned, just once. Their eyes met. Elias felt it then, like the world held its breath. Then the bear disappeared into the trees. Months passed, then a year. Elias never spoke of him, not even to the new rangers. But the name lived in his chest like a heartbeat. The forest grew quiet again. Life went on. And then the stories began. First, a report from a station 3 miles north. Large grizzly, keeps to the edge of the camp. Doesn't approach, watches. Then another. Scarred paw, no aggression, just lingering. Rangers joked about it and called him the Sentinel. But Elias felt something stir. On a crisp December morning, he found tracks near his own cabin. Massive prints, and one dragging slightly. The old scar. He knelt in the snow, gloved fingers brushing the indentation. "It can't be," he murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. That night he waited, lantern dimmed, rifle holstered, untouched. Just the trees, the snow, and his whistle. He stood at the clearing's edge, breath fogging in the cold. For a long time there was only wind and silence. Then softly, almost too softly to hear, a huff. Elias turned. At the tree line, a shape emerged. Massive, broad-shouldered, covered in snow, eyes like dark fire. Takakota. The bear stood still, not a growl or a challenge in him, just breath, recognition. Elias raised the whistle to his lips and blew, a long rising note, then two short ones. The wind answered. Takakota didn't move. He didn't need to. In the space between that note and the snow, the bond returned. Fragile, unbroken. Elias didn't step forward. He didn't need to. The forest was watching, and in it stood a memory, made flesh. A cub who had survived fire and time. A ranger who had broken the rules and found something deeper. Neither quite wild, neither quite tame, just together, and that somehow was enough. Now, the snow whispered beneath Elias's boots as he followed Takakota into the forest, the massive grizzly moving with a grace that belied his size. Moonlight pooled between the trees, silvering the frost-laced pines, turning the bear into a living shadow. The forest, blanketed in snow, was silent save for the soft crunch of Elias's steps and the occasional huff from the bear ahead. Takakota moved slowly, deliberately, pausing at intervals as if to ensure Elias was still following, or perhaps measuring whether it was safe to lead him further. Elias's breath clouded the air, heart thudding not from fear but from awe, from a stirring he hadn't felt since the day he'd let the cub go. The whistle still hung from his neck, tucked beneath his scarf. His fingers brushed it absently, more out of memory than need. The bear didn't require prompting anymore. The bond had been reignited, not with words or domestication, but with something older, primal, trust. They passed a broken alder tree, its trunk shredded with claw marks, bark stripped away. Nearby, the snow was disturbed, scattered with paw prints, fox, rabbit, and something else, something heavier. Takakota paused at the edge of a narrow ravine, nose lifted to the wind. Elias followed his gaze. The silence grew dense, thick with warning. At the base of the ravine lay the twisted body of a red fox, half buried in snow. Blood had frozen into the earth, staining the white in a grim bloom. Around it, wolf tracks. Elias crouched beside the remains, studying the prints. They were fresh, maybe a day old, circling the body like vultures before vanishing into the deeper woods. A pack had been here, and judging by the size and number of tracks, they were organized. Hungry, not scavenging, hunting. His brow furrowed. Wolves weren't strangers to Denali, but they rarely came this close to human territory. Something was driving them, scarcity, displacement, maybe even competition. He looked up at Takakota, who stood still, his great head lowered slightly, as if watching Elias's thoughts unfold. "You brought me here for a reason," Elias murmured. "You saw them. You know." The bear didn't move, only blinked slowly, then turned and began walking again, uphill toward the ridge. Elias followed without question. They reached the edge of a clearing where the snow was untouched, the stars above clear and crystalline in their frozen brilliance. Takakota stopped just before the tree line, body alert, ears twitching. Elias knew the bear would go no farther. Not tonight. This was his threshold. Beyond it lay whatever danger or territory he wished not to violate. Elias stood beside him, silent. The bear's eyes shifted to him, a low huff escaping his throat, a sound Elias hadn't heard since their earliest days. Not a growl, not a warning, just presence, connection. Elias nodded slowly. "I'll look into it," he whispered. "You've done your part." Takakota turned without ceremony and vanished into the darkness, his shape swallowed by the woods. Elias remained a moment longer, letting the stillness settle over him. Then he turned back, heart heavy with something like purpose. The next morning, the ranger station buzzed with unease. Reports had come in of missing animals, goats from a nearby farm, a sled dog found dead near the edge of a trail. Wolves, the reports claimed, bolder than before, pushing boundaries. Elias read through the complaints quietly, fingers drumming on the desk. His colleagues debated policy. Should they investigate, relocate the pack, lay traps? Elias said little, but in his chest the truth weighed heavy. Takakota had known before any of them. That night, Elias packed a small kit, rifle not for hunting but protection, dried meat, emergency supplies, and a thermal blanket. He didn't file a route, he told no one. Some truths required solitude. He ventured into the woods at dusk, following the path Takakota had led him along, marking the clawed alder tree in the ravine. Beyond that, the trail grew wild. He hiked for hours, snow deepening beneath his feet, wind rising through the branches like distant breath. He found signs of movement, half-eaten kills, scat, trails broken through the underbrush. But no wolves. Not yet. As darkness fell, he found shelter beneath an overhang of rock, built a small fire with dry twigs and his emergency starter. He laid the blanket down, rifle close, but sleep elusive. The forest felt tense, like a held breath. In the small hours of the night, the quiet shattered. A snarl, a growl. The unmistakable clash of animal against animal echoed through the trees. Elias leapt up, rifle in hand, heart hammering. He followed the sound downhill, crashing through the snow, branches slapping his face. Then, in a moonlit clearing, he saw them. Wolves, 6 or 7, gray shadows circling something large and roaring. Takakota. The bear was bleeding, his flank torn, his great body swaying, but he stood tall, snapping his jaws, swinging his paws with savage strength. One wolf lunged too close and was swatted aside with a sickening crack. Another tried for the back leg, but Takakota spun, biting down hard. The rest darted, testing. They weren't just hunting, they were challenging. Elias didn't think. He raised the rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The crack split the night, shocking the clearing into momentary stillness. The wolves froze, eyes glowing, calculating. Takakota turned his head briefly, just long enough to see Elias standing at the edge of the trees, rifle raised, breath panting in clouds. The wolves backed away, slowly, then vanished into the dark, melting like smoke between the trees. The silence that followed was deafening. Elias rushed forward, kneeling beside the bear, whose breath now came ragged and low. Blood stained the snow. His eyes fluttered, but remained open. Elias pulled the thermal blanket from his pack and laid it over the bear's massive body, knowing it would do little but needing to try. He sat with him through the night, feeding bits of meat, speaking in low, soothing tones. "You stubborn old fool," Elias murmured, brushing snow from Takakota's snout. "Why'd you take them on alone?" The bear made a low, exhausted sound, not pain exactly, but something deeper. Recognition. Elias stayed there until dawn, watching over him like the bear had once watched from the woods. When the sun rose, Elias faced a choice. Takakota wouldn't survive alone. Not like this. He couldn't be left. So Elias made his decision. He hiked out back to the station, eyes hollow, legs trembling. When he radioed for help, he didn't lie. "I found a bear," he said, "injured, too human-friendly to release. He saved my life." The officials came, sedated Takakota, lifted him by sling into a transport. When they asked why he was so calm, why he hadn't attacked, Elias only said, "He remembers." But memory wasn't enough. Rehabilitation deemed the bear too attached to humans. Dangerous, they said. Elias didn't argue. Instead, he filed for reassignment, fought for permits, petitioned donors, pushed until they agreed to a sanctuary, semi-wild land at the edge of Takakota's old territory. It took months, endless paperwork, long calls, but finally it was built. Fenced, monitored, but expansive. Forest, stream, cliffs, and a familiar scent in the air. The first time Takakota stepped onto the new soil, he paused. Then he walked forward, slow and deliberate. He sniffed the air, let out a huff, and lay down beside a patch of pine where Elias had left an old fireproof jacket, the one from the day of the fire. He pressed his nose against it and closed his eyes. And from the ridge above, Elias watched, a soft whistle on his lips, one long, two short. The air answered, and the bear, without lifting his head, replied, a low, gentle huff. Memory, trust, a bond unbroken. Spring thaw came early that year, melting the last remnants of winter's grip from the hills that cradled Takakota's new sanctuary. Snow shrank back into streams, birds returned with hesitant songs, and tiny green shoots dared to pierce the thawed soil, painting the land in cautious hope. Elias McKinley stood at the northern fence line, one boot propped against a weathered post, watching as a warm breeze rippled through the meadow beyond. He hadn't spoken all morning. There was no need. Silence was the language he and Takakota understood best now. The bear was down by the stream, half submerged in its shallows, the thick fur along his shoulders darkened by water, glinting in the sun. He moved slowly, no longer with the restless, unsure energy of a wild creature trying to remember itself, but like a sentinel finally allowed to stand still. The wounds from the wolf attack had healed into thick scars, especially the one along his flank, an angry red ribbon that caught light when he moved. But Takakota carried them like badges, not burdens. Elias ran a hand along the top of the fence, the rough wood catching on a scar across his own knuckles, a reminder of that night. He could still feel the weight of the rifle, the echo of the shot, the silence that followed. It hadn't haunted him, not in the way violence usually did. It stayed with him like a vow. This land was more than earth and trees. It was a promise, built from the echoes of fire, from a bond formed not out of necessity but choice. Takakota lifted his head and let out a low breath, a sound like gravel shifting at the bottom of a riverbed. Elias smiled. That huff always meant the same thing. I see you. I know you. You're here. He reached for the whistle around his neck but didn't blow it. Not today. Today, Takakota didn't need calling. He was already close enough. The sanctuary had taken months to build, twice as long as anyone estimated. Regulations, wildlife approvals, funding from donors who had more concern for visibility than vision. But Elias had pushed it through, one permit at a time, until the land was theirs. Not his. Theirs. 30 acres of fenced wilderness, hills, plains, streams, and caves, patterned carefully along Takakota's old migratory routes. It wasn't wild in the truest sense, but it was free in a way captivity never could be. Wildlife monitors rotated in and out. A few volunteers helped track his movements. But the bear only acknowledged one person. And so Elias came nearly every day, walking the perimeter, checking trail cameras, logging notes he rarely submitted. Some afternoons he just sat beneath the leaning spruce by the ridge, watching, thinking, letting the silence settle. Occasionally, hikers on the public trails just outside the sanctuary boundary caught glimpses of Takakota. Descriptions always the same. A huge grizzly, scarred paw, calm, observant, never threatening. Some even said they heard a whistle and a bear answering. It was enough to spark rumors. A few thought he was a myth, a ranger's ghost companion. But others believed, especially the old ones, the guides, the trappers, the Athabascan elders, who nodded and whispered his name like an old legend walking again. That was enough for Elias. He didn't need them to understand, only to leave him be. One morning as he hiked toward the southern bluff, with his thermos tucked in his pack and a notebook half filled with sketches of Takakota's prints, he found something that made his breath catch in his throat. A single silver feather, wedged between a rock and a tuft of spring grass. Raven. He looked up quickly, half expecting to see one perched in the trees, watching him the way they sometimes did. But the forest was still. Only the wind moved. He picked up the feather, turned it in his fingers. It reminded him of the first fire, the day he'd carried Takakota wrapped in his jacket. A raven had followed him all the way back to the ranger station, circling in slow, deliberate loops above the smoke. He hadn't thought much of it then. Now he wondered. Takakota didn't appear that day, nor the next. It happened sometimes. He would vanish into the backwoods of the enclosure for days, leaving only paw prints and half-eaten fish behind. The bear had never been meant for constant observation. He returned on his own time, ways. But by the fourth day, Elias's worry stirred. He checked the camera traps, hoping for footage. Nothing. He hiked deeper into the sanctuary, past the streams, toward the old tree hollow where Takakota sometimes slept. Still nothing. The air felt different. He told himself it was just wind, just restlessness. But deep down, he knew. On the evening of the fifth day, Elias sat by the fire ring near the edge of the bluff, stirring the last of his coffee with the feather he hadn't meant to keep. A soft crunch in the underbrush pulled his attention sharply to the east. He stood slowly. From the tree line, Takakota emerged. Slowly, weary, but not alone. Elias froze. Behind the bear, limping slightly, was a small creature. At first glance, he thought it might be another cub. His heart leapt and then faltered. But it wasn't a bear. It was a lynx, young, injured, one ear torn. The cat looked like it had been dragged through a thicket and spat out by the forest. It stood close behind Takakota, tail low, flanks heaving with caution and exhaustion. Elias didn't move. The grizzly looked at him, huffed, then continued walking, passing within 15 feet, the lynx trailing like a shadow. The two moved together toward the hollow near the stream. When they vanished into the trees, Elias exhaled slowly, pulse still thudding in his neck. "What are you doing, old man?" he whispered. "Saving strays now?" The days that followed confirmed it. The lynx stayed, skittish, but unhurt. She slept near the stream when Takakota did, followed him when he walked. Not every time, but often enough to notice. The cameras caught it. Wildlife officials flagged it. They wanted to intervene. Too much cross-species dependence, they said. We don't know how stable the behavior is. Elias shut them down. They're not our experiment, he told them. They're survivors. They let it be, for now. But pressure would come again. It always did. One night, after rain had softened the air and painted the trees with that glistening post-storm hush, Elias returned to the bluff and whistled. The note carried into the dusk, long, then too short. From the woods came a huff, not close, but near enough. A shape moved through the shadows, not Takakota, the lynx. She padded to the edge of the fire ring, sat down and watched him. Her eyes glinted in the low light, unreadable. Elias didn't speak. He simply nodded, lifting the thermos to his lips. She sat with him until the stars emerged. Then, without sound, she vanished again. Later, when Elias returned home and scribbled notes into his journal, he didn't write about protocols or anomalies. He wrote one line only. The forest is remembering how to heal. Outside his window, a wind stirred the pines. And somewhere in the deep dark, a bear slept with his back to a stream and a young lynx curled at his side. Two wild hearts, beaten but not broken, remembering together that survival is not the absence of pain, but the quiet choice to keep going. The morning broke soft and pale over Denali, casting long golden beams across the sanctuary as mist curled like memory over the meadow. Elias woke before the sun fully breached the ridgeline, his breath fogging the window of the small cabin built just outside the sanctuary's perimeter, a structure modest in size but rich in what it held. Maps, field journals, boots worn through at the heel, and photos clipped to the wall of a grizzly with fire in his eyes and snow on his muzzle. He rose slowly, shoulders stiff from sleep and years, tugged on his flannel and boots, and brewed coffee that steamed like breath against the cold air. Today felt different. Not ominous, not heavy, but final in a quiet way, as if something long moving through the trees had finally come to rest. He walked the trail to the bluff, with the whistle around his neck and the battered thermos in his hand. The trees greeted him with a hush, the hush of listening. When he reached the familiar overlook, he saw them. Takakota resting in the sun, fur shedding in thick clumps as the last of winter released its grip. And beside him, the lynx. No longer a gangly shadow, but sleek now, confident in her movements, with a new grace in her step and a small silver tag on her collar, a necessary compromise with the sanctuary monitors. She turned at Elias's approach but didn't flee, simply blinked, accepting his presence. Takakota lifted his great head, that familiar huff puffing into the stillness. Elias smiled. Morning, and he said, setting the thermos down on the rock he always used as a stool. He didn't need to speak for long. Takakota already knew everything that mattered. For weeks now, the bear had moved more slowly, not from pain or illness, but with the kind of pacing that came from understanding his time had shifted. He still roamed, still fished, still huffed in response to the whistle, but more often now he lingered beneath the spruce trees where they'd first reunited or slept near the ridgeline, overlooking the wider world beyond the fence, as if remembering what it once meant to be a creature with no boundaries. Elias sat and sipped his coffee, watching as the lynx curled her tail neatly around her paws and pressed close to Takakota's side. The bear didn't stir. His eyes remained closed, his breath slow and even, but Elias could see it, the calm, the peace. It made his throat tighten. He knew what it meant. The night before, he'd received an official letter from the Wildlife Service, written in clipped tones and careful phrasing. Due to Takakota's prolonged, semi-domesticated condition and the natural limitations of sanctuary environments, we recommend a final welfare evaluation. He knew what that meant, too. They wanted to assess if Takakota should be euthanized. Old, scarred, too bonded to humans, too strange to classify. He crumpled the letter that night, tossed it into the stove, and watched it burn. "Over my dead body," he muttered as the flames devoured it. Now, in the golden hush of morning, with Takakota dozing peacefully and the lynx standing sentinel, he made a decision. He would speak at the review board himself. He would show them what the bear had done, how he'd warned them about the wolves, how he'd protected the lynx, How he hadn't just survived, but led, healed, carried something ancient and worthy into the modern world. A bridge, not a relic, but that would come later. For now, he had today. Around noon, he heard footsteps crunching behind him, measured, familiar. He turned to find Mia, one of the young sanctuary aides, her clipboard tucked under one arm and binoculars slung over her chest. "Morning, Ranger," she said, and Elias chuckled. "I haven't been an active ranger in almost a year." "You'll always be one here," she replied, and nodded toward the animals. "He's looking good today." Elias followed her gaze. "Yeah," he said quietly, "he is." She sat beside him, scribbled something onto her clipboard, then lowered her voice. "There's a rumor they're sending a new supervisor from the city. Some bigwig with a background in behavioral science. Word is he doesn't think animals like Takakota belong anywhere near people." Elias exhaled slowly. "Then I'll make him see differently." She nodded, silence folding between them like another branch on the tree of this place. Later that day, Elias took the long loop through the sanctuary, checking boundary lines and paw prints, scanning the trees for signs of predators or encroachment. Everything was quiet, as it should be. When he returned to the ridge near sunset, Takakota was still there, still resting. But this time he lifted his head higher. Elias saw it immediately, the deeper breath, the subtle effort in the motion. The kind of movement a bear makes when something is coming to a close. He approached slowly and sat nearby, legs crossed, back stiff. "You tired?" he asked softly. "You've done more than your share." The lynx padded off to a shaded rock, curling into a loose coil, though her eyes stayed on them. Elias reached for the whistle. Just once, a long note. Then too short, the sound drifted across the clearing like a prayer. Takakota opened his eyes. He looked at Elias for a long moment, and then with deliberate slowness, let out a low, soft huff. Then he laid his head back down. Elias sat there long into the night, the stars kindling above them, the fire in the sky echoing the one that had started it all. And as the wind rustled through the trees and the moon climbed higher, Takakota's breath remained steady, but slower, slower still, until at last it stopped. No gasp, no cry, just silence. A peaceful ending, the kind he'd earned. Elias didn't move, not for a long while. He simply sat beside the bear, who had once been a cub in his arms, who had survived fire and wolves and fences and the slow erosion of wildness, but who had never lost the core of who he was. When he finally stood, the lynx came close again, brushing against Takakota's side. Elias reached down and touched the bear's fur. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." The next morning, word spread through the sanctuary that Takakota had passed. Mia helped prepare a small burial beneath the spruce tree near the stream, where the light filtered down in broken ribbons. The Wildlife Service approved the memorial reluctantly, citing precedent. But people came. Old rangers, hikers who'd glimpsed him on the ridgeline, even a few locals who remembered the fire 2 years ago. They shared stories, some quiet, some reverent, of a bear who had watched, warned, and waited, of a bond that had never broken, of a whistle and a huff in reply. When it was over, Elias stood alone by the grave. The lynx sat nearby, still and silent. He didn't cry, not because he wasn't grieving, but because there was something holy about this goodbye. As if the forest itself had bowed its head and whispered, "Well done." In the weeks that followed, sightings of the lynx became rarer. She was still there, occasionally caught on camera, or seen sunning herself on the rocks, but always alone now. Elias returned often, tending the grave, planting wildflowers along the path, and sometimes when the wind moved just right, he swore he heard a huff in the trees, soft and deep, like the forest was breathing back to him. In time, they placed a plaque near the spruce. Takakota, friend to all, fireborn, forest-bound, a bear who remembered, a bear who was remembered. And below it, just a small engraving of a whistle, one long, two short, and a story that would never fade.